You know, for a solid 40 years, just one piece of legislation completely changed the answer to a really fundamental question: who gets to become an American? So let's dive into the 1924 Immigration Act and really see how it reshaped the entire nation.
Yeah, this quote it perfectly captures what this law was all about. I mean, before 1924, America's front door was, well, relatively open. But after, that door wasn't just closed, it was locked, bolted, and guarded by a brand new set of rules that were designed to meticulously pick and choose who could even get on that guest list.
Okay, so how on earth did this happen? I mean, a law this huge doesn't just appear out of thin air. The 1924 Act wasn't born in a vacuum. Nope. It was really the culmination of decades of rising anxiety, economic chaos, and, let's be honest, some very powerful and frankly pretty disturbing ideas that had really taken hold in American society.
To really get why this backlash happened, you've got to look at this massive demographic shift. See, for most of the 19th century, immigrants were coming mainly from places like Britain, Germany, Scandinavia, Northern and Western Europe. But then, right around the turn of the 20th century, a huge new wave started arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe. Think Italy, Poland, Greece. These folks were often Catholic or Jewish, they spoke different languages, and this change, it just sparked this incredibly powerful nativist reaction.
And that backlash? It has a name: nativism. It's this political idea that the native inhabitants, the people already here, need to be protected from immigrants. And the nativists, well, they argued that these new immigrants were a threat to American jobs, a threat to the culture, and that they just couldn't be assimilated.
So you have this simmering nativist sentiment, and then three major events happen that just pour gasoline on the fire. First, World War I fuels this deep suspicion of all foreigners. Then, a post-war recession hits, and a lot of people start blaming immigrants for taking jobs. And then there was the most sinister influence of them all: eugenics.
Now, eugenics, it was this popular pseudoscience at the time, and it basically provided a supposedly scientific reason to be racist. Its proponents, and we're talking respected politicians and academics here, they argued that people from Southern and Eastern Europe were just genetically inferior, so they'd pushed for immigration restriction to stop what they called the dilution of the American gene pool. Just wild.
And you know, this kind of thinking had been getting baked into law for decades. The 1924 Act was really just the final blow in a long, long campaign. It started with targeting Chinese laborers way back in 1882, then they added literacy tests in 1917, and then the first actual numerical quotas in 1921. But for the people who wanted to restrict immigration, even that wasn't enough.
Okay, so that brings us to the law itself, the Johnson-Reed Act. Let's really break down the mechanics of this thing to see what made it so incredibly powerful and, well, so transformative. Right, so here's the crucial thing to understand. The people who wrote this law had a very, very specific goal. They wanted to socially engineer the nation's demographics. They literally wanted to freeze the ethnic makeup of the country, to turn back the clock to what it looked like decades earlier, before all those so-called new immigrants showed up. And here's exactly how they did it. They came up with this national origins quota system. But the real trick, the key to the whole thing, was the baseline they chose. They set the quota at 2% of the foreign-born population, but from the 1890 census. And that was no accident. They deliberately picked a year that was before the massive wave of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe really took off. And just look at the results. It was absolutely devastating. The annual quota for people from Italy dropped by 91%. For Greece, it was a staggering 97%. So you see, this wasn't just about reducing immigration overall. It was about radically re-engineering who was coming, heavily favoring countries like Britain and Germany, while basically slamming the door shut on everyone else.
But believe it or not, the quota system was only part of the story. The law also had this other incredibly powerful clause, and this one was aimed squarely at immigrants from Asia. It created a simple, brutal, and incredibly effective ban.
So who exactly was ineligible to citizenship? Well, the naturalization law back then was mostly limited to free white persons. And just before this act passed, a couple of Supreme Court cases had ruled that immigrants from Japan and India were not considered white and therefore couldn't become citizens. So by tying immigration directly to citizenship, the 1924 Act basically barred almost all Asians from entering the country. It was a legal backdoor to a total ban.
Okay, so we've been talking about the cold, hard text of the law. But now let's pivot and talk about the human impact, the profound consequences this had for real people, for families, and for the very fabric of the nation for the next 2 generations.
40 years. For 40 years, this one law shaped American life. I mean, really think about that. 40 years is such a long time for a nation's doors to be effectively shut to most of the world. It completely shaped who was born here, what families look like, and who was missing.
The impact was just immense. You had families kept apart for decades, sometimes forever. The cultural connection, that flow of life from home countries, was basically severed. And for the first time, really, the law created this concept of a large-scale illegal alien population, because people who could have previously just entered legally were now completely barred.
And let's be clear, this had life or death consequences. Just imagine for a second. You're a woman in Poland in the 1930s. Your fiancé is in America, but the waiting list to get into the tiny Polish quota is years and years long. And as Nazism starts to spread like a poison across Europe, that quota, that little number on a piece of paper in some government office, it becomes your death sentence. And that story played out for countless people who were desperate to flee persecution.
So, what finally brought this 40-year era to a close? Well, in a way, the same world that created the law eventually provided the very forces that would tear it down.
Yeah, after World War II, after fighting a whole war against a Nazi ideology that was built on racial purity, well, America's own race-based laws started to look deeply uncomfortable. Then, during the Cold War, the quota system became a source of international embarrassment. By 1952, you have President Truman openly calling it inhuman and un-American. Now, his veto was overridden at the time, but you could tell the tide was starting to turn. Finally, right at the height of the civil rights movement, the system just became completely indefensible. So in 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the law that finally gets rid of the national origins quota. But as he's signing it, he says something. He makes what has to be one of the biggest underestimations in presidential history.
Because, wow, was he wrong? The 1965 Act was absolutely revolutionary. By getting rid of those old quotas and instead prioritizing things like family reunification and skills, the law triggered a dramatic, seismic shift in where immigrants came from, away from Europe and towards Latin America and Asia. It's the law that created the diverse, multicultural America that we know today.
And that brings us right up to today. Because even though the Johnson-Reed Act is long gone, you could say its ghost still haunts our modern debates about immigration. The core questions it raised are in many ways just as relevant now as they were a century ago.
I mean, just listen closely, and you'll hear the echoes. The argument in the 1920s was that immigrants threaten American culture and take jobs, while today you hear modern concerns about assimilation and economic impact. The pushback then to select better immigrants based on race has been replaced by calls for merit-based systems. But that underlying impulse to try and socially engineer who gets to come here, it's strikingly similar.
Look, the 1924 Act was one generation's answer to that question. It was an answer rooted in fear and in pseudoscience, and it had consequences that rippled out for decades. And really, it's a powerful reminder that a full century later, we are still debating that exact same fundamental question.